Well, welcome everybody. I'm Alison from the Postgraduate Association. We're very happy to be hosting this workshop this morning, writing an even more excellent critical review with Dr. Patrick Danaher. So we are recording, and I'll post the recording link to our YouTube channel. I'll pop that link in the chat box for you. Please subscribe to our channel so you can get notifications of all the new workshops that get uploaded. And also, I encourage you to be a member of the Postgraduate Association. It's free, it takes only a couple of minutes, and it keeps all these great workshops going all year. So thanks everyone for joining, and it's all yours, Patrick. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alison. Thanks very much indeed. And good morning, everyone. And it's terrific to be with you all again. So in terms of the title of the presentation workshop this morning, Alison very kindly invited me to present a series of these workshops this time last year, the second half of last year. And so we called them writing an excellent, whatever it was, literature review, critical review, journal article, etc. So just to differentiate them this year, we're calling them writing an even more excellent critical review in the case of today. And just to underscore sorry, I'll come back to that with the acknowledgements in a moment. So anyway, that's the background to the title. So it's not meant to be self-delusional delusions of grandeur or anything like that. All right, so in terms of the acknowledgement of country, this is one of my favorite areas of Queensland, the Bunya Mountains and Bunya forests and so on. So Bunya pines, northwest of Brisbane, so a little bit north of where I live in Toowoomba. So on behalf of Empowering Editing, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today, including the Jagera, Gayabal and Jawa people of the Toowoomba region, where I am located, and I pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So that was this is one of the many things I can't do that Alison can do with consummate ease, and that's creating this logo and so on. And that's what was on the calendar of events for SCPA for this month. So terrific. So I went back to this last night when I was polishing and updating the slides for today, and I hope we've covered those three key dot points. All right, so this is what I'd like to cover today. Just to indicate that some of these slides are from last year. However, some of them are new. When we come back to something, it's always a good opportunity to revisit and to add hopefully increased understanding in the last 12 months and so on. So I will indicate where there's new material, and because that to me represents that slightly updated information and knowledge. All right, so there are the things I'd like to cover today. An overarching proposition, which is new, a couple of crucial caveats, defining critical reviews, because that's obviously really important in terms of what they are. The next two are, I think, hopefully useful self-review checklists that you can use. And I will always send the slides to Alison, and she very kindly uploads the recording to the YouTube channel for SCPA. Questions to ask yourself, engaging with the selected text, and then a couple of other things, and then examples of critical reviews in different disciplines and professions. And this again was a suggestion from Alison from last year, which I think is a really excellent one, which is given the diversity of disciplines and programs and courses and professions that the participants today come from, it's appropriate that we look at different examples from some of those. And it's interesting, there are inevitably some generic elements, some commonalities across those, but there are also some discipline-specific differences that are, I think, useful to look at. And then concluding note of encouragement and so on. As Alison mentioned at the beginning, we're planning to finish on time, and I hope to have a bit of time for discussion before that. If there are any questions or people have other points of view, other strategies that people have used for demystifying writing a critical review. So huge thanks as always to Alison. Alison suggested this topic last year, and she also shared some excellent resources with me last year. Also to acknowledge the Southern Cross, so I should update that, sorry, Southern Cross Postgraduate Association. Now, I mentioned this to Alison just informally last time we caught up. From my experience of a few different universities in Australia, by far, Southern Cross Postgraduate Association is the most active in terms of the resources, in terms of the YouTube site, in terms of the workshops, in terms of the advocacy, in terms of providing support and so on. It's really, really commendable. And I have no doubt in a context where it's in some ways increasingly difficult to engage with higher education because of all the pressures that we're under within the sector, but also outside the sector, I have no doubt at all that that vibrancy and consistency and longevity of that support makes a huge difference to the quality of people's study and makes a huge difference too to graduation rates. So well done, Alison and colleagues and everyone else who contributes. And of course, a huge thanks to your good selves for coming along today and so on. All right, now this is new from the presentation from last year, and I will do this with every one of these. And I did this with the workshop last month in terms of writing an even more excellent literature review. And I've called it an overarching proposition, but it's my opportunity to go back and reflect on what I see as the essence, in this case, of writing an even more excellent critical review. And so if we just think about that for a moment, whether it's literature review, critical reflections, journal articles, conceptual frameworks, and so on, there are obviously some commonalities among those, but there are also some quite distinctive features of each of those. So specifically in terms of critical review, I think it is useful for us, whether we've done lots of these, we're up to our 20th critical review or whatever it might be, or whether this is our very first one. And if it is your first critical review, it might be quite straightforward in terms of the way that it's been scaffolded by your lecturer and so on. On the other hand, it might be a piece of mystery. You're really not sure what's involved and so on, partly because the language might be less familiar. So I think it's useful then to go back to what is the audience and purpose of this text? And clearly, in a very pragmatic way, the audience is the person marking the assessment piece. And the purpose is to demonstrate your particular skills, and we'll come to those in a number of these slides. But I think more than that, in terms of what we were just chatting about informally just before we started, critical reviews can be seen as one of several building blocks of whatever journey you're on and whatever your current destination is. So if it happens to be a doctoral study or some kind of research career or whatever, then clearly critical review is an essential building block of that. If that's not the pathway that you're on, either now or ever, absolutely fine, of course. But I also think that there are skills, there's a discipline, to an academic discipline and high level thinking skills related to writing a really, really effective critical review. It's also useful and important to think about the form and function. So the function, I guess, is similar to the purpose and so on, except linked the form, it's got a generic structure, and there are certain expected elements which we'll come to. But as well as that, I think there's always, this is not something I don't think that we should approach robotically, and that there is one correct way. It's almost like a cookie cutter approach to writing a literature, a critical review. Obviously, there are, we see scaffolded examples, and I've got some examples to share later in this workshop. But by the same token, your own intelligence, creativity, intuition, your own experience that you bring to this process of writing a critical review is really important to acknowledge, to value, and to celebrate, and where appropriate to incorporate into the critical review, particularly in terms of your prior professional experience. We'll come back to that as well. I also, and I probably have this in every presentation, this notion of judgment. And it's a really interesting idea, but it's the notion over time, generally over time, and based on growing experience, that you have a sense of judgment of the field in which you are working. And a critical review is in part an assessment of that field, and where you and your sometimes we talk about your positionality or your subjectivity or your position, you know, how you are situated within that field. So to me, a sense of judgment about that is really, really important. And related to that is becoming more confident over time about the value and validity of your judgment, but at the same time recognizing and understanding why it might be that if you've got two critical reviews of the same text or the same pair of texts or set of texts, I would hope and I would imagine that they would be different from each other, because they reflect the judgment, intelligence, experience, etc. of the author. And so that's actually a really good thing. And I guess it's implicit here. I didn't actually write it as such, but implicit in that is understanding that when we do something right, like write a critical review, we are in dialogue with others. We're in dialogue with the person marking. We're also in dialogue with the reader of the review, or hopefully readers of the critical review that we've written. We're also in dialogue with other scholars, other researchers, other professionals working in this domain or field of study or professional practice or whatever it might mean. And that is actually a very good thing, because to me, the research is very clear, and also experience is clear, that it's through dialogue that we develop more refined, stronger, more responsive, better, even more excellent understandings of a phenomenon. All right, so a couple of questions to ask yourselves, I think, as you approach this task. One is, I guess, an obvious kind of question. Why has the lecturer or the tutor or whoever, the unit coordinator, course coordinator, whatever the terminology is for you, why has that person set a critical review as an assessment item for this unit of study? And then presumably to enable you to demonstrate attainment of a particular form of knowledge, skill, and or graduate attribute. So as a former academic myself, I know very well that when we come to set assessment items, we've actually got a lot of license. There's a fair degree of freedom and flexibility, even within the constraints set by the accrediting authority, for instance. We've got a fair degree of license about which kinds of assessment items we choose for particular units or courses. And actually, it's good to have a range of those across the totality of the piece of study that you're engaged in. And so, you know, people might do oral presentations or literature reviews or essays, experientially based essays, or whatever it might be. And so when people select critical review as an assessment item, I'm presuming that they're doing so mindfully and quite deliberately, because the critical review has got certain elements and attributes to it that are not unique, but they're quite distinctive. And then obviously the corollary question, how do you demonstrate that you have actually attained that knowledge, skill, and those attributes and so on? Clearly it's working within the assessment task criteria or the rubric or whatever it is that applies to you. to exhibit, to demonstrate how you have engaged in a really specifically targeted way with the distinctive features of a critical review. So to me, in essence, that's what a critical review is looking for, and that's how you engage with that. Now, obviously, there's a lot more detail than that, but that in summary is what it is. This is an extra slide this morning. So sometimes it's a good idea. You suddenly think, oh, I should add that. And sometimes that's a good idea. Occasionally I think later, no, I shouldn't have done that. But hopefully this will be okay. So as we all know, Bloom has had two sets of taxonomies of educational objectives, as they were called. And it was Bloom et al., Bloom and colleagues and so on. And the second one I think came out in 2001, sometime like that. So they've both been around for quite some time. But for me, Bloom is old and good. And again, in terms of a critical review, another way to think about this, not so much if you like, because it's a taxonomy and a hierarchy, the lower three. What I would replace those three with in thinking about your critical review is a bit of a hold-all, which is description. And so to me, the starting point, obviously you read the text or text that you're reviewing critically and so on, but there is an element of description that needs to go in there. So before you launch into the so-called higher three, you need to describe, you need to explain, and in what that text is about, what the provenance of, or the origins of, what the perceived function of, etc. And so that's description. Now, sometimes with the structure of the review, that's the first paragraph or the first section or subsection. That's okay. Sometimes description is interwoven. If you decide to organize your critical review, in 3 or 4 thematic points, for instance, I've seen that done, and that can be very effective as well. Then you've got these three: analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. Now, in practice, and I think educators, including in higher education, people who set verbs in their course objectives and so on, sometimes struggle with this a bit, because like a lot of these kinds of taxonomies, the dividing point across these is not always clear, and something might have elements of both analysis and synthesis, for example. But in the examples, the discipline-specific examples that we will come to, I think that we can see places where people have done that, presumably implicitly, without referring to this particular taxonomy. But I think it is useful in your in thinking about this to differentiate. So you've got description, you've got analysis, which I guess would be, because it's fourth on this, reading from the bottom, it's the fourth level. You're really analyzing, which is really kind of making sense, and you're beginning to interpret, but it's more about, I guess, saying from your perspective, okay, description might be what the author seemed to have intended, or might even have said, I intend in this piece too. So that's a good starting point, particularly if they haven't done it. So you may need to infer that, and then analysis is where you start to engage with that and add your input into that. Synthesis is interesting because it's, the very name implies that you're putting the text you're looking at, reviewing, in a broader perspective or in a broader context, because synthesis implies that you're bringing in other elements. Now, depending on the requirements of the assessment task, the other element might be your experience. So it might be a particular professional domain where you are being asked in your critical review. You've got this text written by someone who presumably is well known in that field that you're working in, whether that's mental health nursing, or whether that's health promotion, or early childhood education, or software engineering, or whatever it might be. Synthesis might then be, so you put that beside your own professional experience. Or it may not be that. It may be put that beside other literature. So the The direct focus in the review is on this set text or a couple of texts, but you're also being asked to compare it with some other literature, presumably that you find. And then evaluation is clearly where you assess the overall. You make a judgment call. How effective is the text in doing that? Has it covered all the bases? We'll come in more detail to this shortly. Are there things left out? Are there things in the text that you're looking at that reflect a very different context? It's still the same profession, but it may be different in a different country, or even in Australia in a different state or territory where things are done differently, different legislation, and so on. So that's your opportunity in the critical review to demonstrate that you are evaluating that. Now, evaluating is what we do all the time, probably every day of our lives, in terms of which loaf of bread we might buy, or whatever it might be, through to how valuable, how valid, how relevant, how significant is this particular text that we're reviewing. So anyway, another way to think about this, this is even more simplified, is to think about the difference between macro and micro. So in this context, so often, obviously frameworks like Bronfenbrenner, which are very productive in terms of micro through to macro exosystem and chronosystem and lots of systems. But I guess just fundamentally thinking about it, it's just a different way to look at it. Micro is within the text itself, and macro is outside the text and linking the text to its context, or linking the text to your context, which may not be the same as the context of the author and the text's original creation and so on. So hopefully a few things that might assist. All right, so these are really important caveats. But both, I guess they're equally important. The first one is there are many different ways, and legitimate ways, that you can write a really excellent critical review. And sometimes people get a bit depressed by that, or they might say, oh no, I don't want too much choice. But I think it should encourage you to say there is room for you within the requirements of your discipline and profession to put your individual stamp as much as you can within 500 words or 2,000 words, or however long the assessment task is. And equally, anything that I say this morning, obviously, if there's a tension or contradiction between that and what you've been told in your unit or course or program, or by your supervisor, in the case of a thesis, you go with the latter, not with me. All right. So now a few things about, I should say at the outset, I'm sure you've picked up by now, this is a text heavy presentation, and I'm really sorry about that, but it's not about reading every word. It's more about, and this actually can be applied to how you read the texts for your critical reviews. It's not certainly initially reading every word. It's really about getting the sense, what intended meaning is being presented here, and so on, and what are the takeaway messages that you can think about, and so on. So I guess now this I did use last year. To me, this is an old and good one. It's not so old, 2024, Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development in the UK. They do a lot of excellent professional development work for their members and so on. And I just liked the way their take on this was really clear. And so you'll need to think critically, and your lecturer or whoever might have said this to you, and it may well have been discussed in tutorials or online or whatever. And so this is one take on what does it mean to think critically. So it's analyzing and assessing, a little bit like Bloom, at least in terms of analysis, what the author was trying to achieve, the approach they took, how they conducted the research, whether the outcomes were valid and acceptable. So those are all really important points. At the same time, depending on the text you're looking at and the requirement of your assessment task, you might not be able to do all of those. So for instance, you may not, with a single text or even two or three, you may not necessarily be able to comment on whether the outcomes were valid and acceptable. unless you're doing research yourself, and it may be that you've done, a similar experiment and had different results, or whatever it might be. So don't give up. Don't be depressed if you're not able to tick all of these boxes in a single text that you're reading, or even a single critical review. But they're things to look out for, and so on. And so evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of an item's ideas and content, assessing the item's value, whether that's a book, a report, or a journal article, for instance. Now, sometimes people might think, well, who am I to, this is a well-known author in my field. Who am I to say that their ideas and content have weaknesses or limitations? And it's not about being, in terms of critical thinking and critical writing, and indeed critical review, it's not about being destructive for the sake of being destructive, or taking magnifying what is really in proportion a very small omission, for instance, and magnifying it because you feel you have to for the exercise of this for this exercise. So proportionality, keeping things in proportion and in perspective, is actually really important as well. And so I guess choose carefully what you think are the strengths and the weaknesses or limitations. And just remember, the limitations or weaknesses may be absences, which they may be because the author hadn't thought about them, or they may be because the author had to set boundaries around the research and to say, I can only do so much in this piece or this bit of research or this study. So this is what's in scope, and the rest is out of scope. And it would be perfectly appropriate to say, I note that the author identified these points as being out of scope for that particular study. At the same time, those points that were excluded are actually really important for this aspect of professional practice. And so I really hope that future research will address that omission in the current research, that kind of thing. That's professional, scholarly, collegial, and so on. All right, now we'll come to summarize versus paraphrase and so on in a moment. So I guess this is all from the University of New South Wales. Sorry, I've got a reference list at the end. This point is really important, I think, and I've highlighted it already, but it's good to reinforce it. So obviously you're reading the selected text in detail, which is the micro dimension that I mentioned a moment ago. But within the requirements of the task, obviously, it's where possible, and even as part of your own reading, even if it's not explicitly part of the text, it would be good to read a few other things as well in the same field to see what other people are writing about, just in order to put the text you're reviewing in that broader perspective. Okay, now this point about critical, I made this point a moment ago, but again, it's opening it up to value or judgment, a word that I mentioned earlier today. And it is important to understand the topic from different perspectives, and also, and this again depends on the discipline or the profession in which you're working, but it's really important, I think, to remember that critical reviews are not in isolation. They're not in a vacuum. They're in the context of the theories, approaches, and frameworks in your course or program. So if that's social work, for instance, or if something that I've been reading lately, health and medicine, for instance, if that's the differences between the medical model versus the biopsychosocial model and various other social models of health and well-being and so on. So it is appropriate to refer to those as perhaps helping. So for instance, often when you read an individual text, they don't necessarily refer to the paradigm or the model or within which they're located. Sometimes they do, but very often they don't. So depending on the requirements of the task, it's potentially a good idea anyway to look at, okay, so does this text that I'm reading, which the science seems reasonable, or the conclusions link back to the questions or the hypotheses. However, it seems to be located in the medical model, and the field of health in which I'm working, not me personally, but one of you or some of you, the field of health in which you're working has moved away from the medical model. There are some strengths there, but actually you're more focused on um, other approaches to health and well-being and so on. So those are things to think about and see how you go with that. All right. Okay, so it is important to think about what is the intended purpose or apparent purpose of the text, the intended audience, and why it's structured the way that it is. Okay, so I'll go on. Now, this is new from last year, and I think it's a lovely coincidence, because yesterday when I was preparing for this, I came across something from Southern Cross University, and some of you may very well be aware of this already from the Learning Centre, or its equivalent name at SCU. I think that this is really good, and I think this kind of task, it is useful. Questions to ask yourself. It is useful to ask yourself self-reflective questions that help to frame what you're doing. So first of all, what is the author's purpose? A short depending on the requirements, you might actually have to write more than that, but SCU is suggesting starting with a couple of sentences. I like this. If you can't do it, do this. It might mean that you have not read the article carefully enough, or it might mean that the author's purpose is not clear or well developed. So chastise yourself if that's the case, but it's probably more likely if you're reading it and you think, oh my goodness me, I've got no idea what this is meant to be achieving. That's probably more of a sign of the latter, that the author's purpose is not clear or well developed. So again, even from the outset there, you've got a point of critique in terms of critical analysis and so on. So how has the author developed her thesis and ideas? And that may be so it may be a theoretical argument, for instance, that is developed by a series of propositions. It may be argument and evidence. And then it's appropriate to say, okay, so the thesis or argument or idea has been progressed by reference to different kinds of evidence. And that might be statistical, it might be empirical evidence of particular kind, it might be evidence from the author's own experience, which is another kind of empirical evidence, of course. So that's a very useful question to ask. And then the guide goes on, are the ideas supported or not supported by other research, which is again the macro perspective, putting this text in a broader perspective. This next one is really interesting. Is there a particular focus or bias? Is this because of the author's purpose, or assumptions have been made, or because a particular perspective has been taken? Is this a limitation? Now, those are all really, really good questions. And when I work with my own students and the other supervisors, we often talk about this. And sometimes it's what is in a name. So bias, I don't know how you think, but for me, bias has a negative valence. It's got an assumption you're biased. So that's a limitation, that's a problem. Whereas often I prefer to use the word subjectivity, which is either neutral or even has a positive valence. To me, this is making the point that all of us have experiences, we have ways of seeing the world, we have frameworks that we work within, and that sometimes we change because something dramatic happens in our lives that means that that earlier framework does not apply anymore. So lots of things are going on, but we all see the world through lenses. And um, whether the author of a text that you're reviewing, whether that applies to that person and or to yourself, when you're reviewing that text, I think it's really important to remember more about the assumptions that you've got or the particular perspective that you're working within. And in a critical review, to me, it works well if you are able to articulate that where it's relevant. So not to make yourself the center of attention and it's all about me, and the critical review actually doesn't mention the text very much at all. So it's not about that, but it is saying that it is appropriate, in my view, when you're writing a critical review to say, this review comes from my perspective as someone who adheres to the biopsychosocial model of health prevention, for instance, or say in education, how we teach people, I was going to say young people, but how we teach people to read is a continuing debate, which is quite a fierce debate at times. And so depending on what the text is, you might locate yourself within that. And interestingly, just very quickly, and I'll keep an eye on the time. Interestingly, the other supervisor and I met with our PhD student yesterday, and it's only our second meeting, and we were looking at her draft text. And she's obviously very able. She knows what she's doing. She has a particular interest in organizational change. But at least to me, what came through what she had written was that she wrote resistance to change by people working in that enterprise. And reading the text, resistance to change was a problem. And so she, her research questions were about how can we change this? How can we have interventions to bring about a positive change? Whereas when we met yesterday, we actually teased that out, and she was very open to that. And she said, "Oh, I kind of implicitly knew that, but I hadn't really talked with anyone else about it." So, and we weren't being critical of that person at all. And it may still be that she focuses on change and different approaches to change within an organization, but without necessarily the presumption, A, that there's always a resistance to change, and B, that such resistance is always negative and regrettable and that kind of thing. Anyway, and then what's your overall evaluation? Back to Bloom et al. What is the document's worth or value? Does the author achieve his or her purpose? So I really commend, once again, SCU, SCPA coming through very strongly. I think that's an excellent guide and so on. And then I think to finish that one off, what are the weaknesses in terms of, strengths and weaknesses in the way the information is presented, the way the argument's been structured and the evidence has been used and so on. And this question is, I think, a really good question. I have not actually seen that in any of the other guides that I've seen. How does the document contribute to knowledge in this field and to your understanding of this knowledge? I think that's a really great question. It's implicitly positive, but really it's a neutral question, because you could still answer that question by saying, well, it doesn't, or it creates errors in the field or whatever. So it's open in that sense. But I think that's a really good encapsulating question for an excellent critical review. Now, I am conscious of the time. I'll just go through this and then I'll skip ahead to the um, examples of the disciplines and so on. So this is from ANU, who also did an excellent guide and so on. And as you go through, obviously there are commonalities. And this is also a reminder, I think, that um, the texts that you are reviewing critically themselves will differ significantly. So it may be that you've got, I don't know, 3 or 4 quite short texts, and you're writing a critical review across those, which it can be really interesting in itself. Alternatively, you might have a longer single text that you're critically reviewing, in which case these kinds of elements, dimensions, would be relevant. Maybe not all of them, or maybe all of them. So the objectives sometimes are framed as objectives, they're framed as intentions or the aim. Sometimes it's less explicit than that, and you have to dig a little bit more deeply to find out what is it about, what is it trying to achieve. But in doing that, you're already evaluating it, you're already forming a basis for professional judgment. So there may be theory in it, and if so, what do you think about that? And is it relevant? And is it relevant to the article or reading? Is it relevant to you? Sometimes there are concepts there. Sometimes the author is generous and has a nice diagram, a conceptual framework or theoretical framework, and sets out the assumptions about the relationships between individual concepts and so on. Similarly, argument, Sometimes it's very clear and it's actually called an argument or whatever. Sometimes it's a bit more difficult to find out. So the methods may be, you know, for a thesis, an explicit research design and methodology and so on, or they might be statistical methods used to analyze or provide analyze secondary data. For instance, there are lots of ways, but it's really how the information is presented. And then it goes through what kind of evidence is provided and what do you think about that. In terms of what I was saying a moment ago, it is interesting to think about what value positions or value propositions are contained in this text, either implicitly or explicitly, and what do you think about them? Do you agree with them? Do you want to add to them, subtract from them, and so on? What kind of literature? The contribution is a really important question. How does this extend knowledge? So you may read something and you may actually think, yes, this is in itself a reasonable piece. However, this is no different really from 10 other pieces that I've read making the same point. So then your critique might be more along the lines of lack of originality rather than relevance, for instance. Style is important, and then a brief overall assessment. All right, so I will share the slides with Alison, as I said, but let's go through 2 examples from different disciplines, because I do want to leave a bit of time at the end. So in terms of gender studies and sociology, now again, my apologies, this is very text heavy, I realize that, and it's more about what's the structure of how this is set out and so on. So I would call that a reasonable topic sentence. The findings by Renk et al. This is in relation to gender differences in work, and particularly in relation to caring for children and so on, but also more broadly in the home. So the findings by Renk et al. Are consistent with those of other researchers, but also differ on some points. So already, I think that's really clever, because already in a single sentence, we know something about what this particular text that these people are reviewing is about, but we also get a sense that it's got some original features. So already there's an element of assessment or even of judgment, evaluation going on. And so then there's more detailed information about how this links with other literature and so on. But also, in contrast, there's little support by the finding that there's no significant difference, which is a double negative, but that's okay. In fact, other data indicate that mothers, etc., etc. Despite these differences, the findings from these studies are consistent with Renk et al.'s findings, and so on. So within that paragraph, a few things are demonstrated. The authors are showing their knowledge of the field, their mastery of the field, their confidence in writing about the field. And from that knowledge, they are able equally confidently to put Renk et al. In their place. That is to say, do they contribute something new? Is it worth looking at them? And then this continues. Overall, there's supporting evidence for the original proposition, etc., but not for their findings that there are no differences. So this is from another example from SCU. Take note of how the authors used other literature to make judgments, how paragraph is structured, and to do those kinds of things. So it's an exemplar to look at, even if it has nothing to do with your discipline. Okay, another one from nursing education. I know a number of you are in health, including nursing. And so this is, so the aims of this, to propose a policy framework for nursing education. Okay, so what they're looking at is through this critical review, which is in this case a kind of small scale literature review. They want to develop a policy framework, and so they've got more than one text that they're critically reviewing. These are the data sources. In health, if you're in health, you will be very familiar with those, and sources within that particular 10-year time frame and so on. And then this is how they went about specific inclusion criteria. Again, this is kind of building towards a systematic literature review, but in terms of building blocks, you could say that a critical review can be a building block of a systematic literature review or other kinds of literature reviews. So the results, 29 sources were reviewed. I really like it when I read this kind of thing. 3 policy directions were identified. Um, that's a work of synthesis. That's drawing together the threads and saying across the 29 sources, there were 3 main distinct policy directions. Very likely that's original knowledge as well, because very likely these are the first people to review those 29 sources in that corpus, in that set of texts. And so that's a contribution to knowledge, which is really exciting. In terms of their conclusion, compassion expressed when nurses authentically work to understand patients' suffering and become sensitive to their experiences, and then future research. So already just within those two slides, there are encapsulated many elements of a really effective critical review in terms of nursing education. Now, in terms of law, and in terms of modern slavery, I guess this could also be international relations. They've looked at their texts and so on that they're using as the building blocks, again, for their critical review. Right-hand side, one main idea: auditing systems to detect slavery. Synthesis or synthesis of findings, maybe synthesized findings from many sources and references, and then contrast the findings of one paper with another, pointing out disadvantages, and identifies the need for future research. So again, within the right-hand column, you've got key elements of writing a really great critical review from a very specific example. Environmental education, some of you I know are in science, some of you are in education. This might bring that together. So recent analyses of this particular field have highlighted this, mind you, this was from 2001, so obviously some time ago. This article reports on a review of a particular field, a particular part of this overall field, learners and learning in primary or secondary school environmental education. And that's perfectly appropriate. So we know broader field, macro, within that, this is the micro or maybe the meso that they're looking at. Now, this is a very extensive review, went for more than 100 pages, as I recall. So they looked at 100 journal articles, books and reports between 93 and 99. So obviously a lot. But again, like the nursing education example, 3 policy directions here. In environmental education, the author has elicited 6 concentrations or nodes of evidence, and then to go through. And then he, as I recall, goes on and says, okay, now this is the field, but the field is constantly changing. New foci are emerging. We would say even more 24 years later, of course, but even then, new foci are emerging, bringing with them different methodological and conceptual approaches. Now, the review identified issues and challenges arising from that recent evidence, including practical implications, but there's also a need for user reviews as well as academic reviews and so on. So within 2 paragraphs, really, the author has indicated very clearly what's the field, what's his part of the field that he is looking at, what did he do, why did he do it, and what did he find? And in that process, we get a sense of the field being progressed through his contribution to that. Okay, and the last example is from software engineering. And so I thought this was interesting. So University of Toronto, they've got a particular unit or course in relation to, sorry, I've just forgotten what it is. I think it's computing for, anyway. But the point about it is that they've got a couple of examples of critical reviews among the resources that they've got up there. And so this is one of them. So in order to survive the constant change in the software industry, IT workers must make themselves versatile and well-rounded. Okay, and then this particular paper, the requisite variety of skills for IT professionals, is what is being critically reviewed here. And so this is a description. It demonstrates the new set of skills. and a bit of an early judgment. It will be appropriate for IT professionals to develop these skills. Okay, so it's really saying, it's not saying at the outset this article is irrelevant, we shouldn't even read it. And then we might call that a balanced judgment. The article goes to a far extent, or a reasonable extent, to demonstrate the importance of these skills. However, the research itself could be enriched by additional methods of research. And then they go on, it could be enriched by considering other data, such as terminated employees, which is obviously a very specific phenomenon. And then there's a rationale for that. So the student author is not just making that claim and then moving on. They are saying why it's important to look at that category of people, because they've got distinctive kinds of experiences that are relevant and so on. The article does not tackle the problem head first. So that's the kind of overarching point. So, and sorry I'm going so quickly, but I do want to encourage all of you. It's the kind of thing, it's always good to remember that academics do not set students up to fail, and they do not create assessment items so that people will fail those assessment items. They create them so that people will pass and will do well in them and so on. There are lots of exemplars around, there are lots of people you can talk with, and certainly exercising your own judgment and so on. There are some references. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Some references and a little bit about empowering editing, and then wishing you well with everything. So thanks very much, and thanks, Alison.
Okay, excellent. Nice to see some really good examples of how scholars write a critical review. Um, so over to the students really for the last few minutes, if you've got some comments or questions for Patrick while we have him with us. Bridget is saying great examples. Thanks,
Thanks, Bridget.
Bridget. Yeah, it does help to see how scholars write a critical review, you know, as
Yeah.
you say, their topic sentence or yeah. Uh, yes, you're welcome to put your microphone on or chat in the chat box if you'd like to ask or comment on anything that was presented today.
Or
Um,
you, sorry.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
it's Dani here. I was just really interested in the aspect of actually putting yourself into it and really reflecting your own thoughts. I'm just about to start a systematic critical review in health, and from the readings I've done so far, they're, talking very much about it being a systematic process and what have you. But I really like that idea about, being able to really put your own thoughts and yourself into it, which has given me a little bit of heart with my project that I'm about to start. So I just wanted to say thank you for that thought and that direction.
Thanks, Danae. And look, that's really great. And just thinking about that, obviously it's really important to speak with your lecturer or whoever to make whoever's marking it, at that level to see that that's okay and so on. But thinking about it this way, in terms of the thesis, for instance, it's off when I examine a thesis, I really like, some people call it a personal note, some people call it the biographically situated researcher, but it's getting to know the person, why they're interested in that topic and so on, and how that's framed, how they've approached it. So within the critical review, Danae, and moving forward for you, I'm sure that you can find ways to do that where you draw on your own perspective and the way that and your own experiences, as much as you're happy to share about those in the text. And the point about that is that adds to the authenticity of your review, of what you're writing, because it doesn't, you haven't just made it up. It comes from you as a person with experience, personal experience, and also professional knowledge. And so absolutely, I really encourage you to do that. The only caveat, just make sure the marker is happy with that. Some people say, oh no, using the first person, that's terrible. How dreadful.
Yeah, absolutely, I will. But thank you very much for that perspective.
Thanks, Danae, and I wish you well. Yes.
Just a comment in the chat from Bridget. She's found it very helpful and she's writing her literature review for her PhD thesis,
Yes.
Which is a big job, and had to learn new skills to organize her searches. That's right.
That's great, Bridget, and wish you well with that. And is that it? You know, we can be daunted by it. There might be so much out there, but over time, Alison and I have talked about how we wrote our literature reviews for our PhD theses. And, you know, at first it can be really daunting, but over time patterns emerge and you begin to see what is this field, what's going on, and how can I contribute to it? So, yeah.
That's right. Okay. Any more last comments or questions? We have a few minutes. You know, this is your forum, students, so
Bridget, climate change and education, which among other things is highly political, of course, just to add a bit of excitement and adrenaline to life. But again, Bridget, it's, as I'm sure you know, it's finding your place and where you're comfortable. And sometimes that takes time, but it's almost always through dialogue with others and having animated conversations with people sometimes, you know,
yes.
and sometimes it's someone articulating something you think, actually, I don't agree with that, you know, and that can be really useful because then you think, why don't I agree with that? Why do I have a different position? So, yes.
Well, all the best, Bridget. An
Yes.
important topic. Yes. Of course, you know, writing a critical review is not just for coursework students, so I'm pleased to see
Yeah,
some
that's right.
researchers here as well. Yeah, it's open to all.
Yes. And it's interesting, Alison, isn't it? Some people would probably never do a critical review in their degree, depending on what they're doing, and yet it's got really important skills that are quite distinctive. So, yeah.
And just on Danae's point of like including yourself, it has to be delicately done, I guess.
Yeah.
But I guess if you can add a sentence of your insight, how this, you know, this author's article changed your ideas about your
Yeah.
project or
Yeah.
gave you new
Absolutely.
insights about ways forward or just something, you know, not too much about yourself. It is a balance, isn't it?
Yeah,
But
it is. Yes.
yeah.
And Nat, sorry, absolutely, Alison. So Nat, getting back into PG Cert of mental health, all the best with that. It's good to re-engage. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Just before we finish up, Patrick will be back again with us in September. And I'm just posting that in the chat box. He'll be back on Wednesday, the 17th of September, and he'll be delivering how to write an even more excellent conceptual framework in qualitative research.
Now, this is
So
Alison's challenge to fit that within the...
the headline's getting longer and longer, but it's all good. So have a look at that. It's very helpful too, whether coursework or research. Most all are welcome. There's our events calendar for September, absolutely chock-a-block, full of great workshops there. So thanks everyone. Bookmark this one. Yes, great. Thanks, Karen. Yeah, the recording will go up this afternoon or tomorrow. In regards to literature review, there are a few other workshops on literature reviews if you have a good look through that YouTube library. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Bridget.
Very good.